Imagine waking up one morning to find the horizon completely blotted out by ships. Not a dozen ships. Not 100. Nearly 1,000 warships, carrying 40,000 battle-hardened soldiers, sitting just off your coastline. And those were just the ones who arrived first. Another fleet was coming. 3,500 more ships. 100,000 more men. And the only thing standing between them and the complete conquest of your civilization was a wall. A stone wall. Built in a hurry by terrified people against the most powerful military empire the world had ever seen. This is the story of the Genko Borui, and why military historians still talk about it as one of the most brilliant defensive engineering decisions in all of recorded history. Let's go back, because to understand why this wall was so extraordinary, you first have to understand exactly what Japan was up against. By the late 1270s, Kublai Khan had already done the impossible, or rather, he had done it repeatedly. His Mongol empire had swallowed China. It had broken Korea into submission. It had shattered the ancient empires of Central Asia, terrified the kingdoms of Eastern Europe, and swept across so much of the known world that cartographers were still scrambling to keep up. The Mongols weren't just a military force. They were a phenomenon, a rolling catastrophe that had humbled every civilization that dared stand in their path. And Kublai Khan, sitting atop all of this, looked east across the water and noticed one small, stubborn island chain that hadn't yet bent the knee. Japan. In 1274, he sent them a message. The message came in the form of a fleet. The first Mongol invasion of Japan hit like a thunderclap. A combined force of Mongol, Korean, and Chinese troops landed at Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu, Japan's westernmost major island, and the obvious entry point for any force coming from the continent. The Japanese samurai who rode out to meet them were in for a violent education. These were warriors who had trained their whole lives in an honorable tradition of single combat, one warrior calling out another, dueling with formal precision. The Mongols didn't care about any of that. They came with coordinated infantry formations, cavalry that moved with terrifying discipline, poisoned arrows, and something the Japanese had never encountered before: gunpowder bombs, exploding projectiles hurled through the air, bursting on impact, sending shrapnel and fire into men who had no idea what was happening to them. The samurai were brave. They were outmatched. The Mongols established a beachhead. They pushed inland. And then, here's the part that would define the next 7 years of Japanese military thinking. A storm rolled in off the sea. Ships were damaged. Supplies were threatened. The invasion force pulled back to the water and ultimately withdrew, battered by weather and concerned about their exposed position. Japan had survived. Barely. And the Kamakura shogunate, the military government running Japan at the time, sat down and asked themselves a single, brutal question. What do we do when they come back? Because they knew. Everyone knew. Kublai Khan wasn't done. He was never done. The first invasion wasn't a war. It was a warning. The second invasion would be the real thing. What followed was one of the most remarkable and underappreciated military construction projects in medieval history. The Japanese didn't wait. They didn't pray and hope the Mongols would forget about them. They studied what had happened at Hakata Bay in 1274 with almost scientific intensity, and they identified the single most important factor that had made the Mongol landing possible: the beach. The flat, wide, open beach that had allowed Mongol ships to pull in close to shore and unload their cavalry directly onto usable ground. Cavalry was the soul of Mongol warfare. This cannot be overstated. The mounted archer, a warrior who could fire arrows with extraordinary accuracy while riding at full gallop, was the weapon that had broken kingdoms across 3 continents. The entire Mongol military doctrine was built around mobility, around the horse. You get the horses ashore, you form your lines, and nothing on the battlefield can stop you. The Japanese had learned this the hard way in 1274, and so they made a decision that was as simple as it was audacious. They were going to take the beach away. Construction of the Genko Borui, sometimes called the Ishitsui, began along the shores of Hakata Bay. The wall stretched for approximately 20 kilometers, running along the coastline in a continuous defensive line. It stood roughly 2 to 3 meters high. The seaward face was steep and hard, designed not for lookouts to stand on, but to present an unyielding vertical obstacle to anything trying to come ashore from the sea. The inland side was more gradual, allowing Japanese defenders to move quickly along the wall's length, rushing to reinforce wherever an attack materialized. Construction was organized province by province across Kyushu, each region responsible for its section of the wall. Materials were hauled in: stone, sand, heavy fill. Some sections were built as solid stone masonry. Others used a sand-filled core packed behind stone facing, a practical adaptation to local terrain and available resources. This wasn't elegant palace architecture. This was brutal, functional, purposeful engineering built under the pressure of knowing that an empire was coming for you. The work was massive, the timeline was urgent, and the workers knew that the quality of their effort might determine whether Japan survived as a civilization. And then they waited. June 23, 1281. The Eastern Route fleet arrived at Hakata Bay. 40,000 troops, 900 ships. The commanders stood on their decks and looked at the coastline, and what they saw stopped them cold. Where there had been open, inviting beaches 7 years earlier, there was now a continuous stone wall running along the waterline as far as they could see. Every flat landing zone they had used before was gone, blocked, sealed behind 2 to 3 meters of stone. They tried anyway. Of course they tried. These were Mongol soldiers. They didn't come this far to turn around at a wall. They attempted to land at multiple points along the coast, probing for weaknesses, looking for gaps. They found Japanese defenders waiting at every position, firing arrows and hurling projectiles from behind the wall's protection, able to reposition rapidly along the inland side. The Mongols could seize small islands just offshore. They managed that. But a mainland foothold in Kyushu? Every attempt was repelled. Every approach was blocked. The wall had done exactly what it was designed to do. And now the Mongol commanders faced a problem they genuinely had no answer for. Their cavalry, 40,000 soldiers worth of horses and mounted warriors, was sitting on ships, unusable. The horses couldn't simply be pushed overboard because they would hit the steep stone face at the waterline. The Mongols had no specialized landing equipment, no ramps designed for this scenario, no cranes to lift animals over a wall, no landing craft built for a fortified shore assault. The weapon that had shattered kingdoms across Asia was neutralized before a single cavalry charge could be attempted. The most powerful military force in the world had been surgically disarmed by engineers. So they waited offshore. And they waited. The plan was to hold position until the Southern Route Army arrived, a force that would dwarf the Eastern Fleet. 100,000 additional troops, 3,500 more ships. Together, the combined force would presumably find a way to overwhelm the wall through sheer numbers. So the 40,000 men of the Eastern Army sat cramped on 900 ships in the summer heat, off the coast of a country they couldn't reach, waiting for reinforcements. Weeks passed, and in those weeks, something shifted. It was the Japanese who now held the initiative. Unable to land, unable to deploy cavalry, unable to do anything except sit on ships in the summer heat, the Mongol force began to decay. Disease spread through the overcrowded vessels. Morale rotted in the humidity. Men who had ridden across the steppes of Asia and fought in campaigns across 2 continents were now dying of sickness anchored off a coast they couldn't touch. And the Japanese made sure those weeks were as miserable as possible. Night after night, small Japanese boats slipped out from shore in the darkness, approaching the anchored Mongol fleet quietly, boarding ships, killing crews while they slept, then fading back into the black water before anyone could mount a proper response. It wasn't enough to destroy the fleet, but it was enough to keep the enemy sleepless and terrified, to make every night feel like a threat, to wear away at the psychological endurance of men who were already suffering. The Mongol army was not broken yet. The southern route fleet finally arrived, and suddenly the combined force was immense. Over 100,000 men, thousands of ships, anchored together around Hakata Bay and nearby Takashima Island. This was the invasion the Japanese had feared most. The question of whether the wall could hold against a force this size would never get answered, because in mid-August of 1281, the sky changed. What came next wasn't a battle. It was annihilation. A massive typhoon, the kind of storm that meteorologists today estimate would qualify as a category level weather event, struck the region with catastrophic force. Mongol ships were not designed for Japanese coastal waters. They were river vessels and shallow draft transports, never meant for the open ocean in a storm of this magnitude. The fleet that had projected the power of the world's greatest empire across the sea was shattered in hours. Ships capsized. Ships were driven onto rocks. Ships simply disappeared beneath waves that historians estimate may have swallowed tens of thousands of men in a single night. Those who made it to shore were hunted down by Japanese forces waiting on land. The invasion, the largest seaborne military operation in history up to that point, ceased to exist. Kublai Khan received the news back at his court and reportedly refused to believe it. Then he believed it. He began planning a third invasion. Then, slowly, under the weight of costs and logistics and the political realities of his empire, he stopped. He died in 1294, having never tried again. Japan would never again face a Mongol fleet. The Great Storm would be remembered in Japan as the kamikaze, the divine wind. The idea that heaven itself had intervened to protect the islands entered Japanese national mythology and would stay there for centuries. But here's what that mythology sometimes obscures. The storm wasn't the plan. The storm was luck. What the Japanese built with their hands. The Genko Borui, that 20-kilometer line of stone along Hakata Bay, was the plan. And it worked.